The gravel crunched beneath Richard Miller's polished black boots as he stepped out of his car, the sound sharp and deliberate in the stillness of the Blue Ridge Precinct's parking lot. He dressed with intention, that morning faded jeans that hung comfortably on his frame, a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the strength in his forearms, and a baseball cap tugged low over his brow. To anyone passing by, he might have been a mechanic dropping off a part, a father picking up a wayward kid, or just another nobody drifting through the day. But Richard was no ordinary man. Beneath that unassuming exterior burned a fire fueled by purpose. He was the newly appointed chief of police, tasked with dismantling a department drowning in whispers of corruption and choking on its own arrogance. As he adjusted his cap, his dark eyes swept across the lot, taking in every detail with the precision of a man who'd spent 2 decades reading rooms and rooting out rot. Officers milled about in the late morning, some huddled in tight knots, their laughter spilling out in bursts, others hunched over phones or scribbled notes, oblivious to the world around them. The air carried a casual ease, a lightness that felt almost rehearsed, but Richard could sense the tension simmering just beneath it. It was in the way one officer's shoulders stiffened when another walked by, the quick glances exchanged like silent warnings, the unspoken rules that seemed to govern who spoke and who stayed quiet. This wasn't just a precinct, it was a kingdom of complacency, a fragile empire built on years of ignored complaints and buried truths. Richard's chest tightened as he took it all in with fear, but with the weight of what lay ahead. He'd seen this before, in cities bigger and smaller than Blue Ridge, but here it felt different. Here, the stakes pressed against his ribs like a blade. He moved toward the side entrance, his steps slow and measured, each one a choice to remain unseen for just a little longer. He'd declined the fanfare of a public introduction, the polished speeches and flashing cameras that would have announced his rival to the world. That could wait. For now, he wanted the raw, unfiltered truth kind that only came when people didn't know they were being watched. Inside, the precinct hummed with life. Phones rang in a relentless chorus, keyboards clacked like distant gunfire, and somewhere down a hall, a burst of laughter erupted, rough and unrestrained. The air was heavy with the bitter scent of burnt coffee, undercut by the sharp bite of industrial cleaner that clung to the tiled floors. Richard's gaze roamed the room, cataloging everything, the clusters of officers leaning over desks, some buried in paperwork, others gesturing wildly as they swapped stories. A few heads turned his way, their eyes brushing over him with mild curiosity before flicking back to their tasks. No one stopped him, no one cared, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He could feel the pulse of the place the way some voices carried louder, commanding attention, while others hovered at the edges, hesitant and small. It was a dance of power, subtle but unmistakable, revealing the alliances and rivalries that had taken root over years of unchecked egos. Richard's heart beat steady, but his mind was a storm. He'd pored over the reports before coming here, pages filled with civilian complaints of excessive force, racial slurs tossed like casual greetings, and a code of silence that shielded the guilty while crushing anyone brave enough to speak. He'd known what he was walking into, but standing here now, surrounded by the living, breathing evidence of it, the reality hit harder. It wasn't just a job. It was a war against a culture that had festered too long, a fight for justice that would demand everything he had. As he neared the break room, a ripple of laughter broke his thoughts. A group of officers lounged near a cluttered desk, their voices loud and careless. Another one of those reports came in. One of them said, a weary man with a buzz cut and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. You know how it goes, always whining about something. The others chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made Richard's jaw clench. He didn't need to hear the rest to know what those reports meant: grievances from people like him. Black men and women who dared to expect fairness from a system that too often spat in their faces. He forced his hands to stay loose at his sides, resisting the urge to ball them into fists. Not yet. He told himself, this wasn't the moment to step in, no matter how much the dismissal stung. The sound of boots thudded behind him, heavy and purposeful. Hey, you. The voice sliced through the noise, sharp and dripping with authority. Richard turned slowly, his face a mask of calm. and found himself staring up at a broad-shouldered officer with a badge that read Daniels. The man's blue eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer as he sized Richard up, taking in the scuffed sneakers, the worn jeans, the cap shadowing his face. "Who the hell are you? And what are you doing here?" Daniels demanded, his tone thick with disdain, loud enough to draw every eye in the vicinity. Richard parted his lips to answer, but Daniels waved a hand, cutting him off. "Never mind. Lost. Huh, this isn't a damn shelter. Move along." The words landed like a slap, amplified for the audience now gathering, officers leaning against walls, arms crossed, grins spreading like wildfire. Richard stood his ground, his voice low but steady. "I'm just passing through." Daniels stepped closer, his grin sharpening into something predatory. "Passing through. Let me save you the trouble. You don't belong here. People like you never do." The laughter swelled, a chorus of amusement that echoed off the walls. Richard's pulse hammered in his ears, every muscle in his body screaming to react, to wipe that smirk off Daniel's face with the truth of who he was. But he held back, swallowing the fire in his throat. This wasn't the time, not yet. Instead, he turned and walked away, his spine straight, his steps deliberate, leaving the jeers to fade into a hum behind him. The intercom crackled overhead. "All personnel to the briefing room, immediately." Richard paused, exhaling a slow, steady breath. The game was up. Observation was over. Now, it was time to move. He hadn't gone far when those same heavy footsteps pounded after him again. "Hey, you." Daniel's voice snapped through the air once more, sharper this time, laced with irritation. Richard turned, meeting the officer's glare with an unshakable calm. Daniels loomed over him, his broad frame filling the hallway, his smirk twitching with impatience. "You lost or something," he barked, his eyes raking over Richard's clothes again, lingering with exaggerated contempt. "This isn't a drop-in center. You don't belong here." Richard held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not lost," he said, his voice even but carrying a quiet weight. Daniels tilted his head, his grin stretching wider, uglier. "Then why are you standing in my precinct like you own it?" The words oozed condescension, and the small crowd of onlookers, officers propped against desks, sipping coffee, watching like this was their morning entertainment, shift closer, their smirks growing bolder. Richard didn't answer right away, and the silence seemed to needle Daniels further. He stepped in, his voice rising for the room. "Let me guess, you were here to cry about something, right? How the system's unfair, how we're not kissing your ass enough." The jab was pointed. "The people like you," left unsaid but deafening in its implication. Richard's jaw tightened, a flicker of heat rising in his chest, but he kept his face still. He'd met men like Daniels before, bullies who hid behind badges, who thought power was a free pass to degrade anyone they didn't like. "Do you treat everyone this way?" Richard asked, his tone calm but cutting, a blade wrapped in velvet. Daniels laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and closed the distance between them. "Only the ones who don't belong," he sneered. "And from where I'm standing, you're about as out of place as a fish in the damn dessert." The onlookers erupted, some chuckling openly, others nudging each other with approving nods. One officer, a lanky guy with a crooked grin, leaned back against a desk, crossing his arms like he was settling in for a show. Another, a woman with sharp features and a clipboard tucked under her arm, muttered something under her breath, sparking a fresh wave of laughter. Then Daniels crossed a line. Without warning, he spat a wet, deliberate glob that struck Richard's cheek, sliding down his skin in a slow, warm trail. The room froze. The laughter died, replaced by a thick, uneasy silence. A chair scraped somewhere as an officer shifted, discomfort rippling through the crowd. Richard didn't flinch. His breath caught for a split second, a flash of rage surging through him, but he smothered it. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face with meticulous care, folding the cloth neatly before slipping it back. The silence stretched, every eye on him, waiting for the explosion Daniels clearly craved. Instead, Richard met the officer's gaze, his voice steady as stone. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" Daniels' smirk flickered, his bravado wavering under the weight of Richard's unflinching stare. "Only the ones who don't belong," he repeated, but the words sounded thinner now, less certain. Richard said nothing more. His eyes swept the room, taking in the mix of reaction, some officers still amused, others shifting uneasily, a few staring at the floor. Then, with a quiet dignity that dwarfed Daniel's bluster, he turned and walked away. The laughter trickled back, but it was muted, hesitant, as if the room itself wasn't sure what it had just witnessed. Minutes later, the precinct's briefing room buzzed with restless energy as officers filed in, their chatter a low roar. Daniel stood near the front, arms crossed, still riding the high of his performance, swapping smirks with his buddies. The weary officer from earlier clapped him on the shoulder, muttering something that drew a smug grin. The woman with the clipboard lingered near the back, her sharp eyes darting around, her posture stiff with something like unease. Richard entered last, his cap still low, his presence unnoticed until he stepped to the podium. The room quieted, confusion rippling through the crowd as he removed his hat, revealing the face they'd dismissed moments ago. "I'm Richard Miller," he said, his voice clear and commanding, slicing through the murmurs. "Your new chief of police." The silence that followed was deafening, a collective intake of breath as realization crashed over them. Daniel's face drained of color, his smirk vanishing as his arms dropped to his sides. The weary officer froze mid-laugh, his hands still hovering near Daniel's shoulder. The woman in the back straightened, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip, her lips parting in quiet shock. Richard let the moment hang, his gaze sweeping the room, locking eyes with Daniel's for a beat longer than the rest. "What I saw today," he continued, "is a disgrace to the badge you wear. A culture that thrives on disrespect, on power twisted into cruelty, ends now. Justice isn't a word we throw around, it's what we live, or it's nothing." His words landed like thunder, each one a reckoning for the years of silence and complicity. Daniel stared at the floor, his earlier swagger reduced to a faint tremble in his hands. The weary officer shifted uncomfortably, his bravado evaporating. The woman in the back clutched her clipboard tighter, her eyes gleaming with something like hope or fear of what came next. In that room, the lesson was stark and undeniable. Power abused carried a price, and justice, when it arrived, spared no one. For Richard, it was just the beginning, the spark igniting the long, hard fight to rebuild what had been broken. For Blue Ridge, it was a mirror held up to a community that could no longer look away. The precinct thrummed with the low hum of morning activity, a restless energy threading through the air as officers shuffled into the briefing room. Some clutched steaming mugs of coffee, the bitter aroma mingling with the faint scent of damp uniforms and polished leather boots. Others exchanged quiet jabs and half-hearted laughs, their voices bouncing off the drab beige walls in an attempt to shake off the sluggish weight of the early hour. At the front of the room, Captain Harris stood like a weathered oak, his stout frame squared beneath a crisp uniform. His gray mustache twitched as he tugged at his tie, eyes darting to the clock with a flicker of impatience. The intercom had crackled to life minutes earlier, summoning everyone with an urgency that hung unspoken in the room. For weeks, the precinct had been adrift, a ship without a captain since Chief Caldwell's retirement. Now, at last, the new chief was about to step into the light, and curiosity buzzed like static through the crowd. Through a side door, Richard Miller entered with the quiet precision of a man who knew the weight of every step he took. His tall frame moved with purpose, each motion deliberate, as though he'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. In his hand, he carried a leather folder, its surface embossed with the precinct's insignia symbol of authority. That felt heavier than it looked. As he approached the podium, his dark eyes swept across the room, cataloging every face in an instant. Some officers sat up straighter, their attention sharpening under his gaze. Others slouched, indifferent, their expressions dulled by routine. Then his focus settled on Officer Mark Daniels, who lounged against the back wall with an air of casual defiance. Daniels smirked faintly, arms crossed, his posture radiating a cocky assurance that bordered on insolence. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, and something unspoken passed between them, a spark of recognition that made Daniels' grin waver, though he quickly masked it with a scoff. Earlier that morning, Daniels had stood in the hallway, his boots scuffing the chipped linoleum as he watched Richard stride past. The stranger's plain cloth as a simple jacket and Slack had marked him as an outsider in Daniel's eyes, someone who didn't belong in the precinct's tightly knit world. Probably thought he could waltz in here and get a guided tour. Daniels had muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. A few of his colleagues had chuckled, their laughter thin and hollow. But Daniel's smirk had lingered as Richard vanished around the corner. He'd felt a surge of smug satisfaction, a petty triumph over someone he assumed was powerless. What he didn't know none of them knew was that the man he'd dismissed wasn't a lost civilian or a hapless visitor. He was their new chief of police, and the storm he was about to unleash would soon tear through their complacency, like a blade through paper. Now, in the briefing room, Captain Harris cleared his throat, the sound sharp enough to cut through the murmur of voices. "All right, settle down, everyone," he said, his tone gruff but steady. "As you know, Chief Caldwell stepped down last month, and we've been waiting for his replacement. I'm pleased to introduce your new chief of police, Richard Miller. He brings an impeccable record and a clear vision to lead this department into the future." The officers turned their heads toward the podium, some with guarded curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. Richard set his folder down with a soft thud, opened it, and paused, letting his presence fill the silence. He could feel the room shift beneath him, the weight of their stares, the mix of anticipation and resistance simmering just below the surface. Daniels shifted his weight, his earlier bravado fading as a cold realization began to creep up his spine. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice low yet resonant, slicing through the stillness with the authority of a man who knew exactly who he was. "My name is Richard Miller, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." The words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples of unease through the room. A few officers exchanged quick, nervous glances, their fingers tightening around their coffee mugs. Others sat rigid, their faces carefully blank, as though afraid to betray their thoughts. Daniels dropped his gaze to the floor, his jaw clenching as the memory of his earlier taunt replayed in his mind, sharp and humiliating. Richard pressed on, his tone unwavering. "This morning, I arrived early and walked these halls in plain clothes. I didn't announce myself or flash a badge. I wanted to see this department as it truly isn't the polished version you might show a visitor, but the raw, unfiltered reality of how you operate when you think no one's watching." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle over them. The air grew thick, charged with a tension that pressed against every chest. What I saw was revealing and troubling. I witnessed a culture that tolerates disrespect, where dismissiveness isn't just overlooked but celebrated, where belittling others is treated as a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. His eyes flicked briefly to Daniels, who squirmed under the scrutiny, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "Let me be perfectly clear, that ends today." A low murmur stirred through the crowd, a ripple of discomfort that Richard silenced with a raised hand. "As law enforcement officers, we carry a sacred duty to protect and serve our community," he continued. "That demands respect not just for the people we're sworn to safeguard, but for each other. Without it, we don't just fail as officers, we fail as human beings. And when we fail, the consequences ripple far beyond these walls. They erode the trust of every citizen who looks to us for justice." His words hung heavy, a stark reminder of the power they wielded and the fragility of the bond they'd let fray. Daniel's chest tightened, his breath shallow as Richard's gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He felt exposed, as though the new chief could see straight through his bravado to the gnawing unease beneath. The room held its breath, waiting for what came next. Then a voice broke the silence, rough and bold, cutting through the tension like a jagged edge. "With all due respect, Chief," said Officer Steve Carter, his burly frame rising slightly from his chair in the middle of the room. A seasoned veteran with over 2 decades on the force, Carter's deep voice carried the weight of experience and a hint of defiance. "You've been here for half a day, and now you're standing there telling us how we should run our department." His words were blunt, his tone teetering on the edge of insolence. A few officers nodded subtly, their loyalty to Carter, a man who'd earned their respect through years of gritty service quietly, emboldening them. Richard met Carter's stare without flinching, his expression calm but unyielding. "You're right, Officer Carter," he said, his voice steady as steel. "I've been here less than a day, but it didn't take long to see that this department has a problem, a deep, systemic rot that's been festering for years. It's not just about isolated incidents, it's about a culture that's taken root, one that shrugs off accountability and buries misconduct under excuses. If we don't address it, it'll keep eating away at the trust this community has in us until there's nothing left." Carter leaned back, his thick arms crossing over his chest, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "And you think you can fix that overnight?" He shot back, his tone sharp with skepticism. "No," Richard replied, stepping away from the podium, his eyes never leaving Carter's. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes effort, accountability, and a willingness to face the ugly truths we'd rather ignore. But it starts with leadership. It starts with setting a standard and holding every single one of us to it, myself included." His voice grew firmer, each word a deliberate strike. "Easy to say, you might think, but this job isn't about words, it's about actions. And my actions began this morning when I saw behavior that has no place here." The room seemed to shrink, the air growing colder as Richard turned his attention to Daniels. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a whip. "Your conduct this morning was unacceptable. You didn't just disrespect me, you disrespected the badge you wear and the values it stands for." Daniels opened his mouth, a protest forming on his lips, but Richard's glare silenced him before he could speak. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation into your conduct. This isn't a warning shot, it's the start of a reckoning for the culture that's been allowed to thrive here unchecked." Gasps punctured the silence, a wave of shock rolling through the room. Daniel's face flushed a deep crimson, his fists clenching at his sides as humiliation burned through him. He stared at the floor, unable to meet the eyes boring into him from every direction. Carter's bravado faltered, his broad shoulders stiffening as he absorbed the weight of Richard's resolve. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging wide-eyed glances, others shrinking into their seats as though hoping to vanish. Richard returned to the podium, his voice rising with a quiet intensity that filled the room. "This isn't about punishment for the sake of punishment, it's about accountability. It's about building a standard that defines who we are and what we stand for. If you can't meet that standard, if you can't uphold the trust we're entrusted with, then this isn't the place for you." He paused, letting the silence stretch, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. "But for those of you who are ready to step up, who are willing to do the hard work of being better, I give you my word, I'll stand with you, I'll lead by example, and together we'll rebuild what's been broken starting today." The room remained still, the gravity of his words pressing down like a physical force. Slowly, the officers began to stir, some nodding faintly, their resolve flickering to life, others averting their eyes, wrestling with guilt or defiance. As the meeting ended, Richard stepped down from the podium, watching as the crowd dispersed. Some avoided him entirely, their heads ducked low, their footsteps quick and purposeful. Others offered curt nods, their faces tight with uncertainty. Daniels stormed out without a glance, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles whitened, his rage and shame a tangled knot he couldn't unravel. Carter lingered for a moment, his weathered face unreadable, before turning and slipping out into the hall. The next day, the precinct hummed with a quieter, more brittle energy. Daniel's usual spot in the back corner stood empty, a glaring void that whispered of his absence. News of his suspension had spread like wildfire, igniting a mix of reaction. Some officers admired Richard's decisiveness, seeing it as a long overdue stand for justice. Others bristled, viewing it as an outsider flexing power over their tight-knit ranks. At the heart of the discontent stood Carter, his towering presence a rallying point for the old guard. With his gravelly voice and decades of loyalty woven into the precinct's fabric, he commanded a quiet influence that Richard couldn't ignore. In his new office, Richard sat behind a cluttered desk, the faint scent of wood polish lingering in the air. He pored over Daniel's personnel file, the pages a grim tapestry of complaint-snide remarks, excessive force, incidents swept under the rug by a leadership too lenient or too complicit to care. Each entry was a thread in a larger pattern, one Richard had seen before in other departments: misconduct ignored, records scrubbed clean. A culture of impunity left to fester. But here, he vowed, it would end. The door creaked open, and Captain Harris stepped inside, his heavy footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. Richard didn't look up, his pen scratching notes across a legal pad. "Captain," he said, his voice firm, "I want a full review of every complaint against Daniels, names, dates, outcome, everything. If anything was buried, I want to know who did it and why." Harris shifted his weight, his broad hands clasped behind his back. "Chief, you're kicking a hornet's nest," he warned, his tone low and cautious. "Daniels isn't just some rogue cop. He's got allies here, friends who won't take kindly to this. You're drawing a line, and not everyone's going to step over it willingly." Richard finally raised his eyes, his expression hard as granite. "Then let them stand where they are," he said. "If they're complicit, they'll answer for it too. Justice doesn't bend for loyalty, Captain. Not anymore." The backlash erupted almost instantly. In the break room, Carter held court among a small knot of officers, his voice a low growl that carried through the hum of vending machines and clinking coffee cups. "You all see what's happening, don't you?" he said, gesturing broadly, his thick fingers slicing through the air. "This guy's been here to days and he thinks he's got us all figured out. Daniels was one of the best, rough edges and all. Who here doesn't have a few scars from this job? And now we're tossing him under the bus for doing what we've all done to survive." One officer, a weary man with tired eyes, nodded in agreement, muttering, "Feels like he's just picking us off to prove a point." "Exactly," Carter snapped, his voice sharpening. "This isn't about fixing anything. It's about power. He's not here to lift us up, he's here to tear us down, brick by brick." His words stoked the embers of resentment, feeding a quiet rebellion that simmered beneath the precinct's surface. From the corner, a softer voice broke through the haze of discontent. Officer Maria Reyes, a young recruit with barely a year on the force, hesitated before speaking. Her dark eyes flicked nervously between Carter and the others, her slender fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "But what if he's right?" she said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "I've heard the stories about Daniels, things he's said, things he's done. Maybe it's not about tearing us down. Maybe it's about making sure we don't lose what we're supposed to stand for." Carter's gaze snapped to her, his expression darkening, but Reyes held her ground, her chin lifting despite the flush creeping up her neck. The room fell quiet, the weight of her words clashing with the bitterness that had taken root. For Richard, the battle was just beginning, but it was a battle worth fighting. The lesson was clear: power unchecked bred corruption, and justice demanded a price. Whether the precinct would rise to meet it or crumble under its own weight remained to be seen. The air crackled with tension as Carter Daniels' spit landed square on Reese's face, a wet insult dripping down his cheek. Reese froze, his breath catching in his throat, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than the act itself. Carter's eyes narrowed into slits, glinting with a dangerous mix of defiance and disdain. "You really think that's defensible?" he growled, his voice low and menacing, daring Reese to step out of line. "Watch yourself, rookie. You're still green around here, you don't get how things roll yet." Reese's chest tightened, his fists clenching at his sides as a wave of shame washed over him. He wanted to snap back, to wipe that smug look off Carter's face, but fear rooted him in place. His face flushed a deep crimson, and he shrank back, shoulders hunching as if he could disappear into the cracked linoleum floor. Around them, the small knot of officers fell into a heavy, uneasy silence, the kind that presses down like a physical weight. Carter stood taller, his presence a suffocating force, his unspoken authority choking out any flicker of resistance. Later that day, the precinct hummed with a different kind of strain as Richard, the chief, summoned the department's leadership team to a meeting. The officers trickled into the briefing room, their boots scuffing against the worn carpet, each step echoing with reluctance. The air was thick, almost suffocating, laden with unspoken grievances and the bitter scent of stale coffee. Carter sauntered in last, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator staking out its territory. He claimed a seat near the back, his broad frame slouching casually, but his eyes remained sharp. Scanning the room, Richard stood at the front, his posture rigid, his jaw set. "Let's cut to the chase," he said, his voice slicing through the haze with a clarity that demanded attention. "I've launched an internal investigation into Officer Daniels' conduct. But this isn't just about one man, it's about the rot we've let fester in this department." Unchecked and unchallenged, Carter leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, the creak of his chair punctuating the silence. "With all due respect, Chief," he drawled, his tone dripping with skepticism, "culture doesn't shift because you slap a suspension on one guy. All you're doing is shredding what's left of our morale." His words hung there, a challenge wrapped in reason, but Richard didn't blink. His gaze was steady, unflinching. "Morale built on fear and wrongdoing isn't worth keeping," he shot back. "If holding people accountable feels like a personal attack, maybe it's time to ask yourself why you're so defensive." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, a quiet current of unease. Carter's face darkened, his brows knitting together as he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Accountability's fine," he said, his voice hardening, "but this smells like a witch hunt. Daniels was a solid capture. He screwed up sometimes, but who doesn't? You hang him out to dry for one rough day, and you think that fixes everything?" Richard's eyes locked onto Carter's, unwavering, piercing through the bravado. "One rough day," he repeated, his tone edged with quiet fury. Daniels' file paints an uglier picture, complaints piling up, patterns of aggression, all swept under the rug. That's not a bad day, Carter. That's a system shielding its own, turning its back on the people we're sworn to protect. Carter opened his mouth, a retort poised on his tongue, but Richard barreled forward, his voice rising like a tide. "This department exists to serve the community, not to prop itself up. Let me make this crystal clear. If you don't buy into that, you've got to choice adapt or walk out. No one's above the law here, not Daniels, not you, not me." The room went still, the air so thick it felt like it could shatter. Richard let his words linger, heavy and deliberate, before pressing on. "This investigation isn't about punishment, it's about clawing back trust. From now on, every complaint gets a hard look. Every officer answers to the same standard. If that rattles some of you, good. It should." In the days that followed, the precinct split like a fault line cracking open. Carter and his loyalists formed a tight-knit clique, their resentment bubbling just beneath the surface. They huddled in corners, voices low and sharp, trading barbed comments about Richard the outsider. They called him a man too naive to grasp their world. But not everyone fell in line behind Carter. Reyes, the rookie who'd flinched under his shadow earlier, felt something shift inside her. She'd spent weeks swallowing her doubts, her stomach twisting every time she let a wrong slide by unremarked. One quiet afternoon, as Richard strode through the dimly lit halls, his shoulders squared with purpose, she caught up to him. "Chief," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "I want to do better. I've stayed quiet about things you're calling out not because I agreed, but because I was too scared to speak. If you mean it about changing this place, I'm in." Richard paused, turning to study her. Her dark eyes flickered with a mix of resolve and vulnerability. After a beat, he nodded. "It starts with owning up, reisto yourself and to what's around you. If you see something rotten, you name it. Silence won't fix a damn thing." Meanwhile, Daniels wasn't going down without a fight. He filed an appeal against his suspension, his paperwork thick with claims of unfair targeting, his pride wounded as much as his record. Carter backed him loudly, rallying anyone who'd listen, branding the suspension an overreach and accusing Richard of flexing power he didn't deserve. But Richard held firm. When the internal review dug deeper, it unearthed a tangle of ugly truths. Daniels's behavior wasn't a fluke, but a thread in a web of cover-ups stretching back years. Harris, one of Richard's trusted captains, brought the findings to his office, his face etched with grim exhaustion. "Chief, this isn't just Daniels," he said, dropping a stack of reports on the desk. "There's a whole network here, cops shielding each other, burying complaints. It's worse than we thought." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of calm, though his mind churned. "Then we keep digging," he said, his voice resolute. "No more hiding, no more excuses." The precinct teetered on the edge of chaos, a simmering pot ready to boil over. Richard knew he was walking a tightrope. Some officers eyed him with guarded respect, while others sharpened their knives in the shadows. But he also knew that justice wasn't a quick fix, it was a grind. A battle against entrenched power that thrived on silence. The lesson was stark: abuse that authority, and the consequences would ripple far beyond one man's fate. Then, just past noon, the radio crackled to life with a 911 call that jolted the precinct out of its brooding stalemate. A man had barricaded himself in a neighborhood convenience store, a shotgun in his hands. The cashier and two customers trapped inside. Dispatchers relayed details in a frantic staccato behavior, threats to shoot. A situation spiraling out of control. Richard, hunched over policy drafts in his office, grabbed his radio and bolted for the garage. Captain Harris jogged after him, his voice tight with caution. "Chief, maybe this is one to sit back and watch, not lead." But Richard's face was stone, his resolve unshakable as he slid into his squad car. The team that rolled out included Carter and his crew officers who'd chafed under Richard's reforms. At the scene, they clustered near their vehicles, weapons glinting under the midday sun, their chatter clipped and tense. Richard pulled up, stepping out with a measured stride, his eyes sweeping the chaos. Barricades lined the street, onlookers pressed against them, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. Carter, the unofficial ringleader, raised an eyebrow as Richard approached. "Chief," he said, his tone flat but his stare loaded, "we've got a live one. Guy's in there, waving a shotgun, threatening to blow heads off. Looks unhingedly high." Richard nodded, taking in the Seneth store's grimy windows, the faint sound of the negotiator's voice crackling through a loudspeaker. "What's the play?" he asked, his calm masking the storm brewing inside. Carter smirked, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "Same as always, wait for a crack, then take him out." Negotiator stalls till he slips. Richard shook his head, slow and deliberate. "We don't know what's driving him, drugs, desperation, something else. One wrong step, and this blows up. Tighten the perimeter, but no one moves in without my say." Carter's jaw clenched, his frustration palpable. "Respectfully, Chief, we've handled this kind of thing before. No offense, but sitting around while this nutcase picks his moment to shoot isn't my style." Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to a steely whisper. "And my style doesn't include dead civilians, because someone couldn't wait. This isn't a suggestion, Carter, it's an order." The air between them buzzed with unspoken fury. But Carter turned away, muttering curses under his breath. As the standoff stretched on, the tension thickened. Inside, the suspect's voice erupted in jagged bursts, screaming for cash, threatening the hostages, his words slurring into a manic rant. The negotiator kept at it, her voice steady but strained, while Carter paced like a caged animal near the squad cars. "We're wasting time," he hissed to one of his buddies, a weary officer with a buzz cut and a scowl. "This guy's a bomb waiting to blow. We've got to move." Without a nod from Richard, Carter waved to officers to follow him, their boots silent on the asphalt as they crept toward the store's side entrance. Richard caught the movement from the corner of his eye, his voice exploding through the chaos. "Carter, stand down." Carter didn't flinch, signaling his team to keep going. "Carter, I said stand down," Richard roared, the command a thunderclap. Carter paused, irritation flashing across his face, then waved off the order. "We're doing the Sayu, can write me up later," he snapped, before kicking in the door. What followed was a blur of pandemonium. The suspect whirled at the intrusion, firing a wild shot into the ceiling as plaster rained down. The hostages screamed, scrambling for cover behind a toppled shelf, their cries piercing the air. Carter barked orders, his voice sharp and aggressive, but it only fed the suspect's frenzy. The man swung his shotgun in erratic arcs, his eyes wide with terror and rage. Richard didn't hesitate. Grabbing a tactical shield from a nearby cruiser, he charged toward the store, his heart pounding as he shouted for the team to hold back. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. Carter cornered near a display of canned goods, yelling at the suspect to drop the weapon, his tone like gasoline on a fire. One hostage, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks, tried to crawl toward the exit, but the suspect spun, leveling the barrel at her. "Stop!" Richard bellowed, stepping into the line of fire, the shield raised. His voice cut through the chaos, firm but measured, a lifeline in the storm. The suspect froze, his trembling hands tightening on the gun, his breath ragged. In that moment, the weight of justice-off choices and their fallout hung heavy. Carter's reckless power play had lit the fuse, and now Richard stood between order and disaster, knowing that every second could tip the scales. The standoff unfolded under a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with the scent of rain that refused to fall. Richard stood at the forefront, his shield raised high, a barrier between chaos and calm. His voice cut through the tension like a steady blade, firm yet laced with an undercurrent of empathy. Lower your weapon, you're surrounded, but this doesn't have to end in blood. No one needs to get hurt. His eyes locked onto the suspect, a man whose life had spiraled into this desperate moment, watching the erratic rise and fall of his chest, the way his hands trembled around the shotgun's grip, as if it were both his lifeline and his curse. The suspect's breaths came in jagged gasps, his knuckles whitening as he clutched the weapon tighter, then loosening as doubt crept in. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the dim light filtering through the shattered windows of the abandoned warehouse they'd cornered him in. Didn't mean for this to happen, he stammered, his voice breaking as tears carved paths down his dirt-streaked face. His resolve wavered, the shotgun dipping slightly, and in that flicker of vulnerability, Richard saw a chance. Then let's fix it, he urged, his tone softening but never losing its authority. Put it down. You don't want it to hurt anyone, I can see that. Neither do I. Behind Richard, Officer Carter shifted impatiently, his boots scuffing the cracked concrete floor. His muttered words barely reached Richard's ears, but their sharpness stung nonetheless. He's not gonna listen. Just take the damn shot. Richard's head didn't turn, but his response was swift and biting, a low growl that silenced Carter without breaking his focus. Quiet, his gaze remained fixed on the suspect, unwavering, a lighthouse in the storm of the man's unraveling mind. Slowly, agonizingly, the suspect's trembling hands lowered the shotgun, the metal clattering against the floor as he sank to his knees, defeated. Richard gestured sharply to the other officers, who rushed forward to secure him, while the Hostiga's 3 terrified workers bound in the corner stumbled toward safety, their sobs echoing in the cavernous space. Outside, the air was cooler, tinged with the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Paramedics swarmed the scene, wrapping blankets around the shaken hostages, whose tearful gratitude mingled with the distant wail of sirens. Richard turned to Carter, the tension between them igniting like a spark on dry tinder. What the hell was that? Richard's voice was a whip, cracking through the space between them. I gave a direct order to hold position. His eyes blazed, not with anger alone, but with the weight of what could have been lost. A single misstep, a trigger pulled too soon, and those hostages might have been carried out in bags instead of blankets. Carter squared his shoulders, his jaw set in defiance, his own frustration bubbling over. Your plan was getting us nowhere. That guy was a hair away from snapping. He made a call. His voice carried the gravelly confidence of a man who'd spent years trusting his instincts. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, quickly masked by bravado. Richard stepped closer, his presence towering despite their equal height. You made the wrong call. You ignored my order and rolled the dice with innocent lives. One twitch, one mistake, and they'd be dead. This isn't a game, Carter. Carter's face flushed, his hands curling into fists at his sides. I've been doing this job longer than you've been giving orders, Chief. I know when to act, and I've spent my career making sure acting doesn't mean sitting on my hands. While a psycho unravels, Richard's response was icy, deliberate, each word a hammer striking stone. This isn't about experience, Carter. It's about discipline. It's about doing what's right, not what feeds your ego. You want to play cowboy? Find another precinct. Their argument drew the eyes of nearby officers, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with rapt curiosity, the air thick with unspoken alliances and brewing dissent. Carter, sensing the audience, lowered his voice to a hiss. We'll see how long your way lasts. Richard's reply was steel-clad, unyielding. Not if you keep undermining it. This is your last warning. Follow orders, or that badge comes off. The words hung between them, a guillotine poised to fall. In the aftermath, the hostages were safe, their lives a testament to Richard's restraint. But Carter's reckless defiance earned him a formal reprimand, his conduct now under a microscope. The precinct split like a fault line. Some sided with Carter, whispering that Richard's rigidity stifled their instincts, while others began to see the value in the order he fought to instill, a bulwark against the chaos of unchecked power. For Richard, the incident was a revelation, a stark illumination of the rot festering within the department. The culture wasn't merely stubborn, it was a beast, snarling and snapping at any attempt to leash it. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about saving the innocent. It was about dismantling the systems that shielded the guilty, a lesson etched into his bones that day. But the cracks widened beyond the standoff. Carter's ally, Officer Daniel, found himself suspended soon after, his own history of misconduct catching up like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Physically gone from the precinct, his influence lingered, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Within days, Daniel struck back, filing an appeal that painted his suspension as a vendetta, a personal attack from Richard fueled by bias rather than evidence. Sitting in a dimly lit bar, the glow of neon signs casting shadows across his face, Daniel nursed a whiskey and vented to Carter. "This guy waltzes in, thinks he's got all the answers," he muttered, his voice tight with resentment, his fingers drumming restlessly on the glass. "But I know he's hiding something. Nobody climbs that fast without burying a few bodies." Carter sipped his drink, his expression a mask, though his silence betrayed a flicker of intrigue. "Even if you dig something up, what's the play? He's not the type to fold easy." Daniel's smirk was cold, predatory. "Oh, he'll fold. I just need the right leverage." Meanwhile, Richard pressed forward undeterred. In his office, Captain Harris, a grizzled veteran with tired eyes and a quiet, loyal tie, dripped a stack of reports on the desk, the thud resonating like a gavel. "You're gonna want to see this," Harris said, his tone heavy with unease. Richard flipped through the pages, each one a dagger to his resolve, a complaints of excessive force, racial slurs scrawled in incident logs, cases buried under vague excuses or outright erased. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightening as the pattern emerged, a tapestry of abuse woven over years. "How many of these got swept away?" he asked, his voice low, simmering with a fury he barely contained. Harris hesitated, his weathered hands clasping behind his back. "Too many." Daniel had French sugar-ups who didn't want the boat rocked over what they called small stuff. Richard slammed the file shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Small stuff? This isn't small. This is a damn epidemic of power run wild, ignored for too long." His frustration wasn't just anger, it was a vow, a promise to himself that the badge would mean something more than a shield for cruelty. Word of the investigation rippled through the precinct, fanning the flames of division. In the locker room, Officer Maria Reyes, a rookie with fire in her veins, confronted Carter, her voice trembling not with fear, but with conviction. "How can you defend Daniel? You've seen the reports, you know what he's done." Carter slammed his locker shut, the clang echoing off the tiled walls. "Complaints don't mean squat, Reyes. People lie to save their own skins. Daniel was a good cop, and now he's being crucified." "Good cop," Reyes shot back, stepping closer, her dark eyes blazing. "Good cops don't spit on people or hide behind their badge to justify hate." Carter loomed over her, his voice dropping to a menacing rumble. "Watch yourself, rookie. You think kissing up to Miller makes you special. You don't get how this place works." Reyes didn't flinch, her stance rooted. "Maybe it's time this place changed." Her words were a spark, igniting something in the officers lingering nearby, their faces a mix of doubt and dawning respect. The day of Daniel's appeal hearing arrived, a storm brewing in the precinct's stale air. Daniel strode in, suit crisp, smirk sharp, his confidence a blade honed by years of dodging consequences. His lawyer spun a tale of a noble officer wronged, a decade of service smeared by a chief with an axe to grind. Chief Miller's decision wasn't justice, it was personal, the lawyer declared, his voice smooth as oil. Richard sat across the room, his face a mask of calm, though his mind churned with the weight of what he'd uncovered. When his turn came, he rose, his presence filling the space without a shout. Holding the file aloft, he began. "Daniel's record does speak for itself. It's a story of a man who's twisted his power into a weapon, shielded by a system that turned a blind eye. This isn't personal, it's accountability. If we can't uphold justice within these walls, how can we claim it outside them? Daniel shifted, his bravado cracking as whispers filled the room. Richard's words landed like blows, stripping away the veneer of invincibility. The appeal was denied, and Daniel stormed out, fury twisting his features, while Carter and his crew watched in brooding silence. That night, Richard gathered his leadership team, his voice steady but urgent. Daniel's not the disease, he is a symptom. There's a network here, officers shielding each other, burying their sins. That ends now. Harris nodded, though worry creased his brow. You're stirring a hornet's nest. She for the old guard's already plotting. Richard's gaze was iron. I'm not here to play nice, I'm here to fix this. If that means ruffling feathers, so be it. As the investigation deepened, Richard and Harris unearthed a web of corruption files rewritten, complaints dismissed, a code of silence enforced by fear. They've got each other's backs at every turn, Harris said, spreading the evidence across Richard's desk, his voice heavy with disbelief. This goes way beyond Daniel. Richard leaned back, the weight of it settling into his bones. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a battle, a reckoning for every abuse of power left unchecked. The consequences of that abuse had scarred the precinct, the community, and the very idea of what the badge should stand for. For Richard, the fight was only beginning, a steep climb against a tide of resistance, but one he'd wage until the rot was burned away. Richard reclined in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight as he steepled his fingers, his gaze sharp and unyielding like tempered steel. The precinct buzzed faintly beyond his office walls, but his mind was singularly focused. Then we dismantle it, he said, his voice low but resolute, piece by painstaking piece. We start with the files, every dusty folder, every buried report. We reopen every case tied to this group, no matter how small, and prove once and for all that the old ways of dodging accountability are dead. His words carried a quiet fury, a promise to uproot the rot festering beneath the surface. Outside, the morning sky hung heavy with gray clouds, casting a somber pall over the city. It was a Thursday, early and restless, when the first chants broke the stillness. A crowd had gathered in front of the precinct, their voices swelling into a rhythmic roar that reverberated off the brick walls and rattled the windows. They were ordinary pleperants, workers, students clutching handmade signs that trembled in their hands. No more corrupt cops scrawled in bold red, accountability now etched in black marker. The air crackled with their frustration, a tangible heat that pressed against the precinct's glass doors, where a line of officers stood rigid, their faces tight with unease. Each shout from the crowd felt like a stone hurled against the fragile shield of authority they'd long taken for granted. From his perch at the window, Richard Miller watched it all unfold. His jaw tightened as he traced the outlines of the protesters below, their anger a mirror to his own resolve. He'd known the storm was brewing. The suspension of Officer Daniels, a man whose name had become synonymous with unchecked aggression, had sent shockwaves through the department, fracturing loyalties and exposing fault lines. The investigation into Daniels's conduct was ongoing, a slow grind of paperwork and witness statements, but it wasn't enough for the people outside. They didn't want promises or half measures. They wanted blood, truth, and a system that didn't turn a blind eye. Richard felt the weight of their expectations pressing against his chest, a burden he'd chosen to carry. Down on the street, Lisa Gordon emerged from the throng, her presence electric. She was a slight woman, but her energy filled the space around her as she gripped a megaphone, her knuckles whitening with the force of her conviction. Her voice sliced through the clamor, fierce and unapologetic, commanding attention like a thunderclap. "How many more times do we have to beg for justice?" she shouted, her words dripping with exhaustion and defiance. "How many more stories of abuse will you bury? We're done with your hollow words." The crowd erupted behind her, a tidal wave of agreement. Their cheers a raw, primal release of years of pent-up rage. Inside, the officers watching from behind the glass shifted uncomfortably, some sneering, others averting their eyes as if the sound alone could pierce their armor. Among them stood Carter, posted near the precinct's main entrance, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a storm cloud, dark and brooding. his lips curling into a faint grimace as he muttered to a younger officer beside him. "This is what happens when you start bending over backwards for them," he said, his tone thick with contempt. "Give them a taste of weakness, and they'll swarm like sharks." The younger officer nodded faintly, unsure whether to agree or simply stay out of Carter's crosshairs. Richard swept into the room then, his presence a sudden gust that silenced the murmurs. "Carter," he snapped, his voice cutting like a blade, "if you've got something to say, say it to my face." Carter turned slowly, his smirk a thin veil over the irritation simmering beneath. "Just laying it out, Chief," he replied, his words clipped. "You give these people an inch, they'll take everything. You're opening the floodgates." Richard's eyes narrowed, his tone dropping to an icy edge. "These people are the community we swore to protect. If you can't stomach that, you're in the wrong line of work." The unrest outside refused to simmer, its heat seeping into every corner of the precinct. That evening, Richard called for a town hall, a desperate bid to bridge the widening chasm. Flyers fluttered across the neighborhood tacked to telephone poles. Stuffed under windshield wipers and words spread like wildfire. By 7 p.m., the precinct's largest meeting room was a sea of faces, the air thick with tension and the hum of barely contained anticipation. Residents packed the rows of folding chairs, their expressions a kaleidoscope of anger, hope, and skepticism. Along one wall, officers sat stiffly, a gallery of uniforms ranging from wary to outright defiant. Carter was among them, arms still crossed, his face an unreadable mask as he stared straight ahead, refusing to meet the eyes boring into him from the crowd. Richard stepped to the front, his boots clicking against the worn linoleum. He scanned the room, taking in every furrowed brow, every clenched fist, before drawing a slow breath. "Thank you for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady, but laced with an undercurrent of regret. "I know why you've come. You're angry. You're hurt. You've lost faith in this department, and I don't blame you one bit. We've failed you. Failed to shield you. Failed to hear you. Failed to hold ourselves accountable. I'm here to tell you those days are over." His words hung heavy, a vow etched into the silence that followed. Lisa Gordon rose from her seat, her posture rigid with purpose, her voice sharp as a blade. Cut through the stillness. "Words are cheap, Chief. Actions, those take guts. Daniels is out for now, but what about the rest? The ones who cover for him. The ones who let my brother's life get torn apart. Where's the justice there?" The room stilled, every eye drawn to her as she gestured to the young man beside her. Malcolm sat hunched, his hands twisting in his lap, his face a map of quiet pain. "This is Malcolm," Lisa said, her tone softening but never wavering. "Last year, Daniels hauled him in for loitering. He wasn't loitering, was waiting for a friend outside a store. But Daniels didn't care. He saw a black kid and decided he didn't belong. Shoved him against the car, humiliated him in front of a crowd, called him a thug. The charges didn't stick, but the scars did." Malcolm shifted, his shoulders drawing inward as the room's collective gaze settled on him. His voice, when it came, was a whisper, fragile but piercing. "I just want to walk down the street without feeling like prey. Is that too much?" Carter seized the opening, his chair scraping loudly as he shot to his feet. "Chief, with all due respect," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "are we really letting sob stories run this department? Daniels did his job. Maybe he wasn't gentle about it, but he kept the streets safe." The room-ignite murmurs swelling into shouts, disbelief clashing with fury. Richard raised a hand, his gesture firm, silencing the chaos, his eyes locked on Carter, hard and unflinching. "Safe for who, Carter?" He shot back. "Not Malcolm. Not the dozens of others who've filed complaints about Daniels over the years, complaints we ignored. Keeping the peace doesn't mean crushing the people we're here for." Carter's jaw tightened, his arms folding again as he sank back into his seat, his silence a smoldering defiance. Richard turned to the crowd, his voice softening but no less resolute. "I know trust doesn't come back overnight. I see the wounds this department has left deep, jagged scars, and I know words alone won't mend them. But I'm asking for your help. You deserve a force you can believe in, and that starts with accountability from me, from every officer in this room, from all of you. Call us out. demand more. And if you see us step up, say so. We rebuild this together, or not at all." A long pause stretched across the room, heavy with unspoken doubts, until Lisa spoke again, quieter now, testing the waters. "What's next, Chief? What's your move?" Richard nodded, his expression grave. "Daniels is the start. Every ignored complaint gets a second look. Every officer answers to the same rule, no exceptions. But it's more than that. We need regular nights like this, open doors, real talk, transparency. Even when it stings, that's how we start." As the meeting wound down, the air shifted still taut, but threaded with a flicker of cautious hope. People filtered out, some pausing to grip Richard's hand, their grips firm with unspoken gratitude. Malcolm approached last, his steps tentative, his voice barely audible. "I hope you're for real." Chief Richard met his eyes, steady and unwavering. "I am, Malcolm. I won't rest until you feel safe here." Back inside, Carter cornered Richard in the dim hallway, his sneer cutting through the quiet. "You think that circus fixed anything?" Richard's reply was cold, unyielding. "It's a step. The question is, Carter, are you with us or against us?" Carter said nothing, his silence a wall between them. The precinct remained a powder keg, but Richard pressed forward. He rolled out mandatory training, grueling sessions on bias de-escalation, and trust building non-negotiable for every badge, from green rookies to grizzled vets. Carter's reaction was predictable, his voice echoing through the locker room as he laced his boots. "Another waste of time." "What's next, Chief?" Hug-a-Thug workshops, snickers rippled among a few, but Officer Maria Reyes, barely 6 months on the force, looked up from her own boots. "Or maybe a chance to do this job right," she said, her voice soft but steady. Carter's glare could have burned holes through steel. 6 months in, and you're schooling me. Save it, rookie." She held his stare a moment longer before turning away, the air between them thick with unspoken friction. The first session unfolded in the same packed meeting room, Richard at the front beside a retired cop-turned-facilitator, his weathered face a testament to years of bridging divides. The officers sat in restless silence, some slouched, others glaring. "This isn't about blame." The facilitator began, his voice calm but firm. "It's about seeing how our past shapes our choice and how those choices can lift up or tear down the people we serve." Carter lounged in the back, arms crossed, his indifference a shield. Reyes, though, leaned in, her pen poised over a notebook, drinking in every word. When surveys on personal biases were passed out, groans filled the room. But Richard's voice cut through. "Gripe all you want. This is happening." The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just about wielding power, it was about facing the consequences. When that power turned to poison, the air in the precinct buzzed with a restless hum that week, a constant undercurrent of unease threading through the officers' daily routines. It was during one of those quieter breakout sessions, tucked away in a dimly lit room with chipped paint peeling off the walls, that the tide began to turn. The facilitator had urged everyone to open up, to lay bare the moments that had carved their views on the badge they wore. Most of the officers sat stiffly, their lips sealed, eyes darting to the floor or the clock ticking relentlessly on the wall. The silence stretched thin, fragile, until Reyes broke it. Her voice trembled at first, a faint quiver betraying the storm of nerves churning inside her. "When I first started here," she said, her fingers twisting together in her lap, "I kept my head down. I didn't ask questions, didn't push back, not even when I knew, deep down, something was off." Her gaze flicked briefly to Carter, who lounged in his chair with a smirk tugging at his lips. Before she pressed on, "I laughed along when they cracked those crude jokes, brushed off the snide remarks, turned my eyes away from things I should have called out. I told myself it was just the way things were, that I didn't have the right to rock the boat." The room grew still, every breath held as her words hung in the air. "But the truth, I was terrified of being the outcast, of looking weak, of being branded as the one who couldn't cut it. That fear turned me into someone I didn't recognize, someone who let wrongs slide because it was easier." Her voice cracked, a raw edge slicing through her confession. But she straightened her shoulders and pushed forward. "I don't want to be that officer anymore. If we're here to protect and serve, it's got to mean everyone and not just the ones who don't make us uncomfortable." Not just the ones it's convenient to shield. When she finished, the silence lingered, heavy and thick, until Richard's voice cut through it like a steady beacon. "Thank you, Reyes," he said, his tone firm yet warm, carrying the weight of someone who understood the cost of her words. It takes guts to look at yourself and admit where you've stumbled. But the real strength, that's in what you do next, choosing to stand up, even when the ground feels shaky beneath you. Later that day, the hallway outside the break room echoed with the sharp click of boots on linoleum as Carter cornered Reyes. He leaned in close, his breath hot with contempt, his words dripping like venom from a snake's fangs. That was a real pretty speech back there, he sneered, his lips curling into a mocking grin. "What's the angle, huh? Trying to kiss up to the chief, score some gold stars?" Reyes turned to face him, her jaw tightening as she met his gaze head-on, her brown eyes flashing with a fire she hadn't known she possessed until that moment. "I'm trying to be the kind of officer I'd want watching over my own family," she shot back, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "If that rubs you the wrong way, maybe you're the one who needs to take a hard look in the mirror." Carter's sneer deepened, but words failed him. He stormed off, his footsteps thundering down the corridor, leaving Reyes standing there, her chest tight with a flicker of doubt. But as she watched his retreating figure, that uncertainty melted into something solid resolve. Unyielding and fierce, she wouldn't let his bitterness pull her back into the shadows. In the weeks that followed, the training sessions began to ripple through the precinct like a stone dropped into still water. Officers who'd once scoffed at the exercises, rolling their eyes at the mention of community trust, started to thaw. Around the scratched-up tables in the briefing room, they shared stories of their own, tentative at first, then with growing conviction. Out in the field, the shift was subtle but real. Fewer barked orders, more measured tones. A quiet effort to untangle knots of tension before they erupted into chaos. The community noticed too, their wary glances softening, their voices carrying less edge when they spoke to the officers patrolling their streets. Richard made it his mission to be a constant presence, his tall frame moving through the halls with purpose. He'd pause to lean against a doorway, chatting with an officer about a call gone sideways, or clap a hand on a shoulder with a nod of encouragement. One afternoon, he found Reyes in the break room, her notebook splayed open on the table, her pen hovering over a page of scribbled thoughts. "How's it going?" he asked, pulling out a chair with a scrape against the tile floor. She looked up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Better than I thought it would," she admitted, her voice tinged with cautious hope. "It's still tough some days. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells, but it's starting to feel like I'm actually doing something that matters." Richard nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Change is a slog, Reyes. It's never clean or quick, but it's worth every step. And it starts with people like you, people who aren't afraid to do what's right, even when it's the harder path." The true test came on a crisp evening, the kind where the air bit at your knuckles and the streetlights cast long, jagged shadows across the pavement. Reyes and Tom Delgado rolled up to a call about a domestic dispute, the kind of scene that could ignite with a single wrong move. A man stood on the patchy front lawn, his voice booming as he shouted at his partner, who hovered near the porch steps, her arms crossed tight against her chest. In the past, this might have spiraled fast-raised voices, cuffs clinking, maybe a scuffle in the dirt. But Reyes stepped forward, her boots crunching on the gravel, her hands visible and empty. "Sir," she said, her tone even, measured, like a lifeline tossed into choppy waters. "Let's just take a breath and talk this out. We're here to help, not to make it worse." She kept her distance, her posture calm but alert, her eyes locked on his. The man bristled at first, his shoulders hunched, his words sharp with defiance. But as Reyes spoke softly, steadily, it began to unravel, his anger giving way to exhaustion. He spilled out the messy tangle of their argument, and by the time the officers left, the air had settled. No arrests, no fists thrown, just to people breathing easier on a cold night. Delgado, a weary guy with a perpetual skeptic's squint, rubbed the back of his neck as they climbed back into the cruiser. "All right," he said, a half smile breaking through. "Maybe there's something to all this training junk after all." Reyes grinned, the weight of the night lifting just a little. Not everyone bought in, of course, The victories were small, hard-won, but they stacked up, fewer complaints filtering in from the community. A slow thaw in the precinct's icy reputation. Reyes and a handful of others became quiet torch-bearers, proving with every call, every interaction, that the department could shed its old skin, but the undercurrent of resistance still simmered. Carter and his crew muttered their gripes in corners, their voices low and bitter, their eyes glinting with defiance. Richard knew the road ahead was long, littered with stubborn habits and bruised egos. Then came the storm of Daniels' rebellion. After his appeal for reinstatement was shot down, Daniels didn't slink away quietly. Instead, he turned his fury into a blade, sharpening it against Richard's name. Behind closed doors, he pored over old files, dialed up ex-colleagues from Richard's past postings, hunting for any scrap of dirt to fling. Carter egged him on, his voice a conspiratorial hiss one evening over lukewarm coffee in the break room. If he's gonna hold us to some saintly standard, let's see if he's spotless himself, he said, his fingers drumming on the table. Everyone's got a skeleton or two stashed away. Daniels struck first with whispers, slipped to local reporters vague hints that Richard had fudged arrest stats years back as a precinct captain in another city. The accusations were flimsy, a house of cards waiting to topple, but they stirred enough muck to draw eyes. Richard faced the press with his chin up, his voice a calm thunder. "I've got nothing to hide," he said, his words cutting through the clamor. "My record's an open booklet, them read it." He ordered a full audit, every report, every number laid bare. Within days, the claims crumbled, the figures holding firm under scrutiny. The reporters backed off, their story dissolving into thin air. And what Daniels had hoped would crack Richard's armor only polished it brighter. But Daniels wasn't done. One night, Richard's inbox pinged with an anonymous email, a video file attached. He clicked play, and there they were, Daniels, Carter, and two others, sprawled in a dimly lit corner of the locker room, their laughter sharp and cruel as they tore into Richard's leadership. "Guy thinks he's some kind of savior," Daniels sneered on the screen, his face twisted with scorn. "Let's see how long he lasts when we start pulling strings." The footage came from a turncoat in their circle, an officer who'd grown weary of their poison and hit record instead of nodding along. The next morning, Richard summoned them to his office, the air crackling with tension as they shuffled in. Daniels wore a cocky grin, Carter's arms were folded tight, and the other two shifted uneasily, their bravado fraying at the edges. Without a word, Richard pressed play, letting their own voices fill the room. Daniels' smirk vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed shock that aged him in seconds. Carter's posture sagged, his jaw twitching as the tape rolled on. When it stopped, Richard's gaze pinned Daniels like a moth to a board. "Is this how you honor the badge?" he asked, his voice low, a controlled burn. "By scheming to gut your own department?" Daniels squirmed, his chair creaking under him. "That's not the whole story," he started. But Richard sliced through the excuse. "Not the whole story." His tone stayed even, but the fury beneath it glowed red-hot. "You've spent weeks clawing at me, not because I've slipped, but because I dared to demand better from you. This isn't about the department, Daniels, it's about your pride, your power. And you'd rather burn it all down than face your own mess." Daniels surged to his feet, his hands slamming the desk, his voice a raw shout. "You don't get it. You sit up here, barking orders, but you don't know what it's like out there with danger, the split-second calls." Richard didn't flinch, his eyes steady as steel. "I've walked those streets. I've stared down the barrel of a gun, felt the weight of those calls. But that doesn't justify abuse, doesn't excuse bias, doesn't give you a free pass to betray the people we swore to protect. That first day when you spat at me, it wasn't just me you disrespect, it was the oath, the badge, every officer who carries it with honor." And now he leaned in, his voice a quiet blade. "You've shown who you really are, someone who'd rather sabotage this place than admit you're part of the problem." The room went still, the air thick with the gravity of his words. Daniels sank back, his defiance leaking away, his eyes dropping to the floor. That afternoon, Richard stood before the press again, his tie straight, his shoulders squared. He laid out Daniels' trail of missteps, cover-ups, the defiance, the pet even detanding with his termination. The message was clear. Justice wasn't just a word here, it was a line in the sand. Abuse power, twist the system, and the consequences would find you, no matter how deep you dug your heels in. For Reyes, for Richard, for the officers teetering on the edge of change, it was a lesson etched in stone. Real strength lay in accountability, and the cost of ignoring it could unravel everything they'd built. The air in the precinct felt heavy that evening as Richard stepped into his office, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He eased himself into the worn leather chair behind his desk, the creak of it echoing faintly in the quiet room. Daniels was gone, finally removed from the force after years of corrosive influence, but the weight of his legacy lingered like a stubborn stain. Richard's chest tightened as he thought about it, his fingers tracing the edge of a coffee mug long gone cold. The man's reign had left deep wounds, not just in the department, but in the community it swore to protect. Erasing that toxic culture wouldn't happen with a snap of his fingers, and Richard knew it. The resistance from some of the old guard officers, too comfortable in the shadows of corruption, still gnawed at him. Change was a slow, brutal grind, and he felt every inch of it. The door swung open, and Captain Harris stepped in, his broad frame filling the doorway. He carried a thick stack of files under one arm, his weathered face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from decades on the job. "Thought you'd want to see these," he said, his voice gruff but steady as he dropped the files onto Richard's desk with a soft thud. "Complaints are down this month significantly." Richard glanced up, meeting Harris's eyes, and for a moment, a flicker of relief softened the hard lines of his face. A faint smile tugged at his lips, barely noticeable, but they're all the same. "It's a start," he murmured, his tone quiet but laced with cautious hope. Harris lingered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his hesitation palpable. Then he spoke again, his words careful but firm. "You handled Daniels better than most would have. Chief, people are watching more than you might think, and not just in here." Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze locking with Harris's. The weight of those words settled over him like a mantle he wasn't sure he wanted to carry. "Let them watch," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "The work's nowhere near done." He meant every syllable. The precinct might have grown quieter since Daniels and a handful of his loyalists chose resignation over reform, but it wasn't the peaceful stillness of resolution. It was the uneasy hush of a place in transition, the absence of chaos leaving room for something fragile and new. Those empty desks weren't a loss. They were an opportunity. Richard felt it in his bones, a chance to rebuild, to root out the rot and plant something worth believing in. He didn't waste a second. Alongside Harris and a small, trusted panel, Richard threw himself into a recruitment drive that felt more like a crusade. The precinct needed fresh blood, but not just anyone would do. Every candidate faced a gauntlet of scrutiny, assumes dissected, backgrounds probed, and character weighed with a precision that bordered on obsession. Richard wasn't looking for warm bodies to fill uniforms. He wanted people who understood the stakes, who saw the badge as a promise, not a shield for personal gain. One afternoon, a young recruit named Caleb Johnson sat across from him in the cramped interview room, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The kid's nervous energy crackled in the air, his foot tapping faintly against the linoleum floor. Richard studied him, his piercing eyes taking in every detail, slight tremor in Caleb's hands, the determined set of his jaw. "Why do you want to join Blue Ridge PD?" Richard asked, his voice even but edged with a quiet intensity that demanded honesty. Caleb swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he met Richard's gaze. "I want to make a difference, sir," he said, his voice starting soft but gaining strength with every word. "I grew up here. I saw how things were, how the community and the police looked at each other like enemies. I want to help change that." Richard leaned back, his chair groaning under the shift, and crossed his arms. He wasn't sold yet. "It's not an easy job," he countered, his tone sharp enough to test the kid's resolve. "Especially not here, not now, with a department trying to claw its way back from the mess it's been in." "Why should I believe you're ready for that?" Caleb didn't flinch. His eyes burned with a quiet fire as he leaned forward slightly. "Because I believe in what you're doing here, Chief. I know it's going to be hard hell, I expect it. But I'm ready to put in the work, every damn day if I have to." Richard held his gaze for a long moment, searching for cracks in the kid's conviction. He found none. "We'll see if your actions match your words," he said finally, a slow nod signaling his approval. Welcome to Blue Ridge. Caleb was just one of many, but he stood out a raw, earnest spark in a sea of applicants. The new recruits flooded the precinct with a vitality Richard hadn't felt in years. They moved through the halls with purpose, soaking up the training sessions he'd fought to implement, asking questions, challenging the status quo in ways the old-timers never dared. Even the skeptics-grizzled officers who'd rolled their eyes at Richard's reforms began to thaw, their grumbling fading as they watched the department knit itself back together. One afternoon, Officer Reyes poked his head into Richard's office, a small stack of papers clutched in his hand. His dark eyes glinted with something like pride, a rare sight on a man who'd spent years keeping his head down. "Chief," he said, stepping inside, "I just wanted you to know Delgado, and I started a mentoring group for the newbies. Figured they could use some pointers while they find their footing." Richard looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face before settling into a warm approval. "Good initiative, Reyes," he said, leaning forward. "Make sure they know my door's always open." Reyes grinned, a quick flash of teeth that softened his usually stern demeanor. "They already do, sir." He turned to leave, but not before adding, "You're getting through to them, more than you might realize." Out in the community, the ripples of change were starting to break the surface. Complaints against officers had plummeted, a fact that hit Richard like a jolt of adrenaline every time he saw the numbers. Patrols that once ended in shouting matches now unfolded with a tentative civility. One evening, Reyes and Caleb rolled up to a noise complaint in a neighborhood where squad cars were more likely to be met with glares than greetings. The street was alive with the thump of music spilling from a weathered row house, kids darting across yards under the glow of flickering streetlights. Instead of barging in with sirens blaring, they knocked on the door, waiting as a weary man in a faded t-shirt cracked it open. Suspicion etched into every line of his face. Reyes kept his voice low, respectful, explaining the call while Caleb stood a step behind, taking it all in. They listened as the man vented about nosy neighbors and a landlord who wouldn't fix a damn thing. 10 minutes later, the music was lower, the man was calmer, and no cuffs had been drawn. As they headed back to the cruiser, a woman stepped out from the porch next door, her arms crossed over a floral apron. Mrs. Ellis, mid-40s with a no-nonsense stare, watched them for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who didn't offer praise lightly. "For listening. It's been a long time since anyone from your department bothered." Reyes tipped his head, a small gesture of acknowledgement. "It's what we're here for, ma'am." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line as she turned back inside. But the exchange lingered in the air, a crack in the wall that had stood between the precinct and the people for too long. Word of moments like that spread, quiet but persistent, threading through barbershops and church pews. At a community meeting one crisp evening, Richard stood in the back of a packed rec center, the murmur of voices filling the room. Lisa Gordon, a weary woman with a voice that could cut glass, rose from her seat. She'd been a thorn in his side for years, her skepticism a constant drumbeat at every public forum. "I won't sugarcoat it," she said, her eyes locking onto Richard's. "I was ready to see you gone. Chief, called for it myself, but these last few months, I've seen things shift. Officers treating folks like people, complaints not just disappearing into some black hole. It's not perfect, don't get me wrong, but it's something." A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd, heads nodding as another man piped up. "It's a start. Feels like you're finally owning up to the mess." Richard stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the worn hardwood. "I appreciate the honesty," he said, his voice steady as granite. "We're not donning at even clothes, but this department's committed to earning your trust, day in and day out. If we stumble, you've got every right to call us out." Not everyone bought into the shift. Carter, a hulking figure with a perpetual sneer, still prowled the edges of the precinct, his influence fraying, but not gone. He and a knot of holdouts muttered in break rooms, their discontent a low simmer that never quite boiled over. One morning, he cornered Richard in the hallway, his shadow falling across the tile like a storm cloud. You think swapping out a few bad apples and slapping some training on us is gonna fix this dump?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Richard didn't blink. "No," he said flatly, "but it's a start. And if you're not on board, Carter, you might want to figure out what's next for you." Carter's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he held Richard's stare for a beat too long before stalking off, his boots echoing down the corridor. Later that week, Richard stood before the entire department, the briefing room packed with officers young and old. The air was thick with unspoken tension, but he didn't flinch. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But we don't get to rest on that. Every day, we choose Scoosh to be better, for ourselves, for each other, for the people out there counting on us. This isn't just my fight, it's ours." The room stayed quiet, but the weight of his words sank in. Some officers nodded, their faces set with quiet resolve. Others stared ahead, wrestling with their own doubts. For the first time, though, it felt like the precinct was inching forward together haltingly. Imperfectly, but forward all the same. With the worst of the rot cut away, Richard turned his focus to locking in the progress. He rolled out the Integrity Oversight Program, a system so thorough it felt like a reckoning. Every move an officer made, every stop, every report, every interaction will be tracked, reviewed, and held to a standard that left no room for excuses. Body cameras, once treated like optional accessories, became non-negotiable, their footage pored over by a new internal audit team. During a morning briefing, Richard laid it out, his voice unwavering. "This isn't about breathing down your necks," he said, scanning the sea of faces. "It's about trust, proving it to the people we serve and to ourselves. If you're doing the job right, you've got nothing to fear. If you're not, we'll know." Carter, slouched near the back, leaned over to a buddy and grumbled under his breath, "More red tape. Like we don't have enough already." Richard heard it, didn't react, but the words hung there, a reminder of the uphill battle still ahead. The program didn't just look forward, it dug into the past. One file landed on Richard's desk with a thud that matched the sinking feeling. In his Guten old excessive force complaint against Carter, buried years ago under layers of neglect. He called Carter in, the air between them crackling as the man sauntered through the door. His usual bravado faltered when he spotted the file, his eyes darkening. "What's this?" he snapped, his voice thick with defiance. "Digging up old dirt now?" Richard didn't rise to the bait. "It's not about the past," he said, his tone cool but unyielding. "It's about accountability. This should have been dealt with back then. It wasn't. That's not on you, but what happens now is." Carter leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, his voice dropping low. "I did what I had to that day. You weren't there. I don't get it." Richard met his glare head on. "I wasn't there," he admitted. "But I'm here now. Tell me your side, and we'll go from there." The conversation ended in a stalemate, Carter storming out with a scowl, but the confrontation left no doubt. Justice, long delayed, was catching up. The lesson wasn't lost on Richard. Power, unchecked, festered, rotting institutions and lives alike. Daniels had wielded his like a club, and the scars he'd left were a warning etched in every corner of the precinct. Carter's defiance, too, was a symptom of that same diseasea belief that the badge excused anything. Richard saw it clearly now. Real justice wasn't just punishing the guilty. It was building something that wouldn't let them rise again. Every step he took, every recruit mentored, every oversight enforced was a brick in that foundation. The consequences of abuse weren't abstract. They were the fractured trust of a community. The cynicism of good officers turned sour, the slow bleed of a department soul. He wouldn't let it happen again on his watch. The air in the precinct was thick with tension as Carter stormed out of the office, his jaw locked tight, teeth grinding against each other in a quiet fury. His muttered curses lingered in the hallway like a bitter aftertaste, barely audible but heavy with resentment. The internal reforms at Blue Ridge Police Department were picking up momentum, a slow but undeniable shift that rippled through the ranks. It wasn't just the officers who noticed. Word had spread beyond the station's walls. Local newspapers, once quick to pounce on the department's every misstep, now churned out articles that cast a hopeful glow on the changes. Headlines splashed across front pages declared, "Blue Ridge Police embrace a new standard of accountability." And Chief Miller ushers in a fresh chapter for law enforcement. For once, the department wasn't just dodging criticism, it was earning a flicker of admiration. One humid afternoon, the sharp ring of the phone broke through the hum of the precinct. A reporter from the Blue Ridge Gazette, her voice crisp and professional, requested an interview with Richard Miller, the man at the helm of this transformation. When she arrived, her notepad in hand and her eyes sharp with curiosity, the questions came fast, direct, probing, but never unfair. She zeroed in on the hurdles he'd faced, the resistance simmering beneath the surface, and the strides he'd made against the odds. "Chief Miller," she asked, leaning forward slightly, her pen poised, "some say your reforms are just a polished facade more about looking good than making a real difference. What do you say to that?" Richard's response was immediate, his voice steady and unshaken. "I'd tell them to sit down with the officers who've thrown their hearts into this, or the people in this town who've felt the change in their bones. This isn't about slapping a fresh coat of paint on a broken system, it's about digging into the mess, doing the hard work, and building something that lasts. We're not here to play dress up, we're here to get it right." The article that hit the stands a few days later was a portrait of a man driven by principle, unafraid to roll up his sleeves and face the storm. Richard came across as a leader who didn't flinch at tough calls, and the words struck a chord. In the community, pockets of praise began to emerge, tentative but growing, like wildflowers pushing through cracked pavement. Even within the department, some officers felt a quiet swell of pride, validation that their sweat and struggle weren't invisible. But not everyone was sold. Over a lunch break in the cluttered break room, the clatter of forks against trays mingled with a heated debate. Reyes, a young officer with a spark of optimism in her voice, leaned against the counter, a sandwich in hand. "It's good to see people finally noticing what we're pulling off here," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. Nearby, Carter slumped at a table, his coffee cup gripped a little too tight. He let out a sharp scoff, the sound cutting through the chatter like a blade. "Noticing? It's all smoke and mirrors. You really think a couple of feel-good stories change how this town looks at us? Give it a month, tops, and they'll be back to tearing us apart." Reyes turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe they will, Carter, but if we keep showing up, keep doing the job right, what's left for them to throw at us? That's the whole damn point." Carter didn't fire back. He just stared into his coffee, the steam curling upward, his silence louder than any argument. Even as the department basked in this fragile glow, new storms brewed on the horizon. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged outline of Blue Ridge's hills, Richard's phone buzzed with urgency. A rookie officer, still green and unsteady, had botched a routine traffic stop. What should have been a simple exchange spiraled into a shouting match. Fists clenched and voices raised, teetering on the edge of something worse. No one was hurt, but the damage was done. The incident lit a match under the public's watchful eye, threatening to undo months of progress. The next morning, Richard stood before the precinct, his face etched with a gravity that silenced the room. "Last night was a wake-up call," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too many battles to flinch. "This work isn't finished, it'll never be finished. We're human, we'll stumble. But what matters is what we do next. This isn't the old Blue Ridge PD, burying our screw-ups and hoping they fade. We face them head-on, we learn, and we make damn sure they don't happen twice." He didn't let it fester. He ordered a full review of the incident, then sat down with the rookie himself. The conversation wasn't a dressing down, it was raw, honest. A dissection of every misstep paired with a roadmap to do better. The rookie left the room shaken but determined, his head still spinning with the weight of his mistake. The incident could have been a disaster, a crack in the foundation they'd fought to build. Instead, it became a testament to the new systems clicking into place. The department's swift, open response didn't just douse the flames, it earned nods of approval from unexpected corners. Lisa Gordon, a local firebrand who'd once wielded her criticism like a weapon, caught Richard after a community meeting. Her arms were crossed, but her tone had softened, a reluctant warmth seeping through. "Chief, I never thought I'd say this," she began, her eyes searching his face. "But I'm starting to buy into what you're doing here. Don't prove me wrong." Richard met her gaze, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I won't, Lisa. We're in this for the long haul." A year had passed since Richard first stepped into the chaos of Blue Ridge PD, a precinct once choked by its own shadows. Now, as he stood in his office overlooking the bustling floor below, the difference was palpable. The air no longer carried the sour tang of distrust or the low rumble of resentment. Officers moved with purpose, huddled over case files, their voices overlapping in focused discussion, while others greeted residents who'd walked in seeking help, not confrontation. The camaraderie wasn't forced or hollow. It was forged in shared effort, a quiet respect that had replaced the old cliques and power plays. Outside, the change echoed louder. Community events, once sparsely attended and tense, now buzzed with life. Kids darted between booths where officers handed out safety pamphlets and chatted with parents, the laughter mingling with the hum of real conversation. Complaints against the department had plummeted, swapped for stories of small Coneessa traffic stop turned into a helping hand. A late-night call met with patience instead of hostility. At one such event, under the sprawling oaks of the town park, Richard felt the shift in his marrow. A boy no older than 10 approached him, his sneakers scuffing the dirt. In his small hands, he clutched a toy badge, its plastic edges worn from play. Richard's breath knew the child instantly. Malcolm, Lisa Gordon's nephew, a kid who'd once borne the scars of an officer's unchecked cruelty. "Chief Miller," the boy's voice was a whisper, fragile but brave. Richard knelt down, the grass cool against his knee, his eyes level with Malcolm's. "That's me." "Buddy, what's on your mind?" Malcolm hesitated, then a shy smile broke through. "I just wanted to say thank you. My mom and Daddy say the police aren't like before. They're not scared anymore." The words hit Richard like a freight train, a lump rising in his throat as he fought to keep his composure. "Thank you, Malcolm. That's the best thing I've heard all day. Tell your folks we're not stopping, we're gonna keep making it better." "All right." The boy nodded, then thrust the toy badge forward. "Here, I want you to have this." Richard took it, his fingers brushing the cheap plastic, his smile wide and unguarded. "I'll treasure it, kid." That night, back at the precinct, Richard gathered his leadership team. The room was dim, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the table. He stood at the head, his voice measured but charged with resolve. "We've come a long way," he said, his hands resting on the table's edge. "But progress isn't a finish line, it's a call to dig deeper, to hold ourselves accountable, to never let our guard down." Captain Harris, a grizzled veteran with gray streaking his temples, leaned forward. "Chief, you've turned this place around in a year, more than most could dream of in a lifetime. Give yourself some credit." Richard shook his head, his expression firm. "This isn't my win. It's every officer who's stepped up, every person out there who's given us a shot to prove ourselves. They're why this works. But we don't coast, not now, not ever." Days later, Richard watched a patrol team navigate a brewing storm of protest outside the county courthouse, voices loud and tempers flaring. In the old days, it would have erupted into chaos, batons swinging and headlines screaming. This time, the officers moved with calm precision, listening more than they shouted, de-escalating with a patience that felt foreign to Blue Ridge's past. By dusk, the crowd dispersed, the air quiet save for the rustle of leaves. Reyes, now a steady hand among the younger officers, caught up with Richard as the last patrol car pulled away. "We're getting there," she said, a tired but proud smile on her face. Richard nodded, his eyes tracing the horizon, one step at a time. As night settled over the precinct, Richard took a slow walk through the halls. Carter was long gone, his resignation a quiet surrender to a culture he couldn't bend to. In his place stood officers like Reyes, Caleb, and Delgado, faces of a new era, their laughter and debates filling the space with life. The toxic webs that once strangled the department had been torn down, not entirely erased, but replaced by something stronger: purpose. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. The road had been brutal, paved with resistance and sleepless nights, but the proof was in the precinct's pulse of force, no longer feared but trusted. Step by painstaking step, in his office, he set Malcolm's toy badge on his desk, its gleam catching the lamplight. The fight wasn't over. Complacency was a thief that could unravel it all, but the groundwork was solid. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about building something worthy of trust. Power, when abused, crumbled under its own weight, but wielded with care, it could lift a community from the ashes. Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of the journey settling into his bones. Difficult didn't mean impossible. Every inch forward mattered, a lesson carved into the soul of Blue Ridge, a testament to what grit, heart, and accountability could achieve, one choice at a time. The early fall sun poured its golden warmth over tree-lined street, bathing the serene suburban avenue in a soft, radiant glow. Long shadows stretched lazily across the manicured lawns, where sprawling homes stood as silent sentinels of affluence. Marcus Reed lingered on the porch of his newly acquired residence, his brow furrowed as he wrestled with a front door lock that refused to yield. Beside him, a small tower of cardboard boxes loomed, symbols of a fresh start, while beads of sweat trickled down his back, plastering his shirt against his skin. He exhaled heavily, a cocktail of frustration and anticipation swirling within him. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, jiggling the key with growing impatience. Not today, not now. He'd only been in the house a handful of days, yet every task felt like a skirmish in an ongoing war to claim the space as his own. Relocating to this upscale, predominantly white neighborhood hadn't been a whim, it was a deliberate choice. Born from a yearning for peace, Marcus craved the stillness, the vastness of the rooms, a sanctuary to retreat to between the relentless flash of cameras on red carpets and the grueling hours on film sets. This quiet, wealthy suburb had shimmered in his mind like a mirage of calm, a perfect haven from the chaos of his Hollywood life. Yet, as he battled the stubborn lock, a quiet unease gnawed at him, sinking its teeth deeper with every passing second. He couldn't ignore the sidelong glances from neighbors, the unspoken questions hanging in the air like a thick fog. "What's he doing here?" Their stares prickled against his skin, and the stiff silences that greeted him on the street left a bitter taste in his mouth. He shook it off, or tried to, focusing instead on the lock that seemed to mock his every effort. The stillness of the afternoon shattered as the low hum of an engine crept closer. Marcus glanced up, catching the glint of a police cruiser gliding down the street. At first, he dismissed it, a routine patrol in a neighborhood where nothing ever happened. The sun glinted off the car's hood, and he turned back to the door, determined to conquer it. But the hum didn't fade. It grew louder, more insistent, until the cruiser rolled to a stop just behind him. The slam of a car door reverberated through the air, followed by the deliberate thud of boots against pavement. A shiver raced up Marcus's spine, cold and unbidden, but he kept his eyes fixed on the lock, willing himself to stay calm. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just a man trying to get into his own house. Still, the weight of someone's stare pressed against him, heavy and unrelenting. "You having trouble there?" The voice sliced through the quiet, sharp and commanding. Marcus turned slowly, his hand still gripping the door handle, and found himself face to face with a white police officer. The man was broad-shouldered, his stocky frame radiating authority, his hand resting casually to casual iron the holster at his hip. His eyes, narrowed and glinting with suspicion, bore into Marcus like twin daggers. Marcus swallowed, forcing a steady tone. Yeah," he said, lifting a hand in a small, placating gesture. "It's just a tricky lock. I just moved in." His heart thudded in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral, hoping reason would prevail. The officer didn't budge, didn't soften, didn't even blink. "You live here?" he pressed, his voice flat, dripping with doubt. Marcus nodded, meeting the man's gaze. "Yeah, I do. Bought the place last week. I'm just trying to get inside." The officer's face remained a stone mask, unyielding. He took a step closer, his hand tightening around the gun's handle. "ID," he barked, the word a demand, not a request. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "What?" The officer's eyes darkened. "Show me your ID. I need to verify you live here." A surge of disbelief crashed through Marcus, followed by a flicker of anger he quickly tamped down. His mind spun, grappling with the absurdity of it all. "Look, officer," he said, his voice steady but edged with exasperation. "I'm just trying to get into my own house. The movers dropped these boxes off this morning. Game just ID. Now, the officer cut in, his tone a blade slicing through Marcus's words. Marcus sighed, his temper flaring, but held in check by years of navigating tense situations. Okay, just give me a second, he muttered, reaching into his pocket with deliberate slowness. He pulled out his wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it over, watching as the officer's eyes flicked down to the card, then back to his face. For a fleeting moment, Marcus dared to hope this would end quickly, that the officer would see the truth, maybe mutter an apology, and leave him to his day. But the officer's face twisted, his lips curling with disdain. "This says you live in LA, he said, his voice thick with accusation, as if he'd caught Marcus in a lie. "I do," Marcus replied, fighting to keep his calm. "I have houses in both places. I just bought this one, paperwork still being finalized, but I'm the owner." "You can check." Before he could finish, the officer lunged forward, seizing Marcus by the collar. The sudden force yanked him off balance, slamming his back against the door with a sickening thud. Pain exploded up his spine, stealing his breath. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus yelled, his voice raw with shock and fear. "Shut up," the officer snarled, his face inches from Marcus's, his breath hot and rancid. "You think you can just waltz in here and rob one of these houses? You're not fooling me." Marcus's hands shot up, instinctively trying to push the officer away. "I'm not robbing anything," he protested, but the officer shoved him harder, pinning him against the door with a forearm pressed brutally against his chest. "You don't live here," the officer growled, his voice low and venomous. "I know your type, thinking you can come into a nice neighborhood, pull some Hollywood stunt. I don't care who you are." Marcus gasped, struggling to draw air into his lungs. "I live here," he rasped, desperation creeping into his voice. "Check the paper check." The officer pulled back just enough to free his fist, then drove it into Marcus's jaw. The blow sent him sprawling to the ground, his head spinning, the metallic taste of blood flooding his mouth. "You think I haven't heard this crap before?" The officer loomed over him, fists clenched, his shadow swallowing Marcus whole. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Dazed, Marcus lay there, his vision swimming. Through the haze, he glimpsed neighbors on their lawns, their figures blurred but unmistakable. They watched, silent and still, their inaction a heavier blow than the punch. "Please," Marcus mumbled, the word barely audible, his strength fading. "Just call someone. Check the records. I'm telling you the truth." But the officer wasn't listening. His mind was a fortress of prejudice, impenetrable and blind. He grabbed Marcus's arm, wrenching him upright with a force that made his joints scream. At that moment, a voice pierced the tension from across the street. "Wait, stop, he's the owner." The officer froze, turning toward the sound as a neighbor, a weary, middle-aged man with a mop of gray hair, sprinted toward them, his face flushed with urgency. Marcus swayed, blinking through the pain, trying to focus on the approaching figure. "He's Marcus Reed, the actor," the neighbor shouted, breathless. "He bought the house." The officer's grip slackened, his face draining of color as he turned back to Marcus. His eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief replacing the fury. Marcus stood there, blood trickling from his lip, his chest heaving with a storm of rage and humiliation. For a heartbeat, the world hung suspended, teetering on the edge of an undeniable truth. "You live here," the officer stammered, his voice trembling. Marcus didn't answer. He just stared, his silence louder than any words, his spirit battered but unbowed. The next day, Marcus slumped on the edge of his plush couch, the luxurious fabric a stark contrast to the ache in his bones. A newspaper lay open on the coffee table, its bold headlines screaming of the previous day's violence. But he couldn't bring himself to read it. His jaw throbbed with every slight movement, a dull reminder of the officer's fist, and he brushed his swollen lip gingerly, wincing at the sting. His mind replayed the scene in relentless loops: lock, the cruiser, the punch, the neighbor's mute stares. His phone buzzed incessantly beside him, a chorus of calls, texts, and notifications. Videos of the assault had ignited the internet overnight, turning his private ordeal into a public spectacle. Everyone wanted something: friends with concern, journalists with questions, activists with agendas, but all Marcus craved was silence, a reprieve from the storm. A sharp knock jolted him from his reverie. He rose stiffly, hesitating as he approached the door, peering through the window to see Greg, his agent, shifting anxiously on the porch. Marcus sighed, knowing this conversation was inevitable. He opened the door, and Greg burst in, his eyes wide with a mix of worry and urgency. "Marcus, man, I've been trying to reach you since last night," he said, almost tripping over his words. "Are you okay? What the hell happened?" Marcus shut the door, leaning against it for a moment to steady himself before drifting back toward the couch. He didn't scythe-paced, restless. "I'm fine," he said, his voice threadbare, worn thin by exhaustion. "It's all over the place, isn't it?" Greg let out a dry, humorless laugh. "That's an understatement. It's everywhere, millions of views already. It's a nightmare, man." Marcus stopped, his gaze dropping to the floor as Greg scrolled through his phone, rattling off headlines. "Actor assaulted by police in racially charged incident. Marcus Reed brutally attacked in own home. Another case of police violence caught on camera." "I didn't want this," Marcus murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want any of this attention." Greg set his phone down, his expression softening as he met Marcus's eyes. "I know, but this isn't something you can just bury, man. It's out there now. Of Ryan's talking about it. You need to respond." "I don't want to respond," Marcus snapped, his frustration boiling over, cracking the dam he'd built around his emotions. "I moved here to get away from all the noise. Greg'd disappear for a while, and now I'm on the face of this." Greg stood, crossing the room to stand beside him. "I get it, Marcus, I really do. But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about what that cop did, what they keep doing to black men every damn day. People are watching because it's real, and you've got a platform. You've got power to make them listen." Marcus turned away, his chest tight with the weight of it all. Justice, he thought bitterly, was a jagged pill, sharp-edged and hard to swallow. The officer's actions had been a grotesque abuse of power, a reminder that authority could twist into tyranny in an instant. And the lesson burned deep. Unchecked power didn't just wound the body, it scarred the soul, leaving echoes that rippled far beyond the moment of impact. He didn't want the spotlight, but maybe Greg was right. Maybe silence wasn't an option when the world was already screaming his name. Marcus sat alone in the dim glow of his living room, his fists tightening until his knuckles ached, his mind a chaotic storm of thoughts and memories he couldn't escape. Greg's words from earlier that day echoed in his head, sharp, undeniable, and heavy with truth. He knew his friend was right, but the realization pressed down on him like a suffocating weight, squeezing the air from his lungs. The last thing Marcus wanted was to wake up tomorrow as the next viral sensation, his face plastered across screens and newspapers, reduced to a symbol in the endless saga of racial injustice. Yet the images burned into his mind refused to fade. The officer's fist crashing into his cheek, the cold, unforgiving pavement rushing up to meet him, the sting of humiliation as neighbors peeked from behind curtains of it unfolding, right outside the sanctuary of his own home. Those moments replayed in vivid, unrelenting detail, each one clawing at his resolve. I don't know if I'm ready for this," Marcus murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Trembling with uncertainty, he slumped forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the scuffed hardwood floor as if it might offer some clarity. To be the voice, to be that guy. Across the room, Greg watched him with a steady, patient gaze, his brow furrowed with understanding. After a long, heavy pause, he nodded slowly, his tone gentle but firm. "Look, man, you don't have to figure it all out tonight. No one's expecting you to have every answer right this second. But you've got to start thinking about it. The world's out there, waiting to see what you do next." Before Marcus could muster a response, a sharp knock rattled the front door, slicing through the fragile quiet. Both men froze, their eyes locking in a fleeting moment of shared alarm. Marcus's stomach twisted as he rose, his legs unsteady beneath him. He crept toward the window, parting the blinds with a cautious finger. Outside, bathed in the harsh glow of a street lamp, stood a young black woman clutching a microphone, her expression a mix of determination and urgency. Beside her, a cameraman adjusted his lens, the red recording light glaring like an unblinking eye. They hadn't spotted him yet, but their persistence was unmistakable, and their knock, louder this time, reverberated through the house. Greg cursed under his breath, his voice a low growl. "They're already here." Marcus stumbled back from the window, his heart hammering against his rib cage, each beat a frantic plea to retreat from this encroaching chaos. "I'm not doing this," he said, his words clipped with panic. "Not today." Greg didn't hesitate. He strode toward the door with purpose, his broad shoulders squared as he took charge. "I'll handle it," he said, cracking the door just wide enough to address the intruders. "He's not available for comment right now," Greg declared, his voice a wall of calm authority tinged with an edge of irritation. The reporter leaned forward, undeterred, her eyes glinting with resolve. "Can you at least tell us how he's holding up? The world saw what happened yesterday. People are crying out for justice. This isn't just about Marcus anymore. It's about the systemic racism eating away at this country." Her words struck Marcus like a physical blow, reverberating through his chest. Greg's tone sharpened, cutting her off. "He's not ready to talk. Give him some damn space." The door clicked shut, and Marcus exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The sound ragged in the stillness. The pressure was relentless, closing in from every direction escapable. He could feel it in the buzz of his phone, the flicker of news channels he couldn't bring himself to mute, the very air of his once peaceful home now thick with expectation. No matter how desperately he tried to shrink into himself, to hide from the storm, the world refused to let him go. Greg turned to face him, his expression softening but still resolute. "You don't have to jump into interviews tonight, man, but you've got to figure out what's next. Sitting here, hoping it all just fades away, that's not an option anymore. You're going to have to push back." Marcus sank onto the couch, the cushions swallowing his weight as he pressed his palms against his temples, trying to silence the throbbing ache. "Push back how, Greg?" he snapped, frustration spilling over. "By screaming at some racist cop on live TV? By dragging the police through a lawsuit? None of that's going to erase what happened." Greg eased down beside him, his presence steadying, his voice dropping to a quieter, more reflective tone. "No, it won't undo it, but it might keep it from happening to someone else." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, filling the room with unspoken truths. Marcus's gaze drifted to the wall, his mind drifting further to the countless black men whose fates had been far worse than his own. Their names etched into history as hashtags, their stories shouted in marches and painted on city walls, yet so often denied the justice they deserved. He didn't want to join that list, to become another fleeting emblem of outrage. But maybe Greg was right. Maybe running from this fight wasn't just cowardice, it was surrender. Maybe this was the battle he'd been dodging his whole life, lurking in the shadows of every sidelong glance, every assumption, every time he'd bitten his tongue to keep the peace. "I'll think about it," Marcus said at last, his voice thick with exhaustion and resolve. Greg gave a small nod, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "That's all I'm asking," as Greg stepped out into the night, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The hum of the world beyond the walls grew louder, a restless, insistent chorus pressing in on him. He stared at the court summons abandoned on the kitchen counter, its bold letters swimming before his tired eyes. Read versus Peter Walsh and the city police department. The words felt alien, like they belonged to someone else's story, not his. But there they were, stark and unyielding, demanding he confront them. He'd made the choice. He was suing the police for excessive force and racial profiling. What started as a single punch, a single moment of shame, had spiraled into something far greater, something that reached beyond him into the rotten core of a broken system. Ready or not, Marcus Reed had become a reluctant torchbearer in a fight that spanned generations. His phone buzzed again, shattering the quiet. This time, he didn't let it ring unanswered. "Marcus, we need to go over the strategy one more time," came the voice of Dana Lewis, his lawyer. The moment he picked up, Dana was a force of nature, sharp-witted, unrelenting, and widely regarded as one of the fiercest civil rights attorneys in the game. Greg had connected them, and from their first meeting, she'd made it clear this wasn't just about winning a case for her. She was here to dismantle the whole damn system, brick by brick. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, a weary sigh escaping him. "Dana, we've been over this 1,000 times. I'm worn out." I know. she replied, her tone softening just a fraction, a rare concession to his fatigue. "But we're up against a department that's been shielding this guy for years. They're not going to play nice, Marcus. You need to be ready for them to hit you with everything they've got." He drifted to the window, peering out at the serene, tree-lined street bathed in moonlight. It was a picture of calm, deceptively so. Beneath that tranquil surface, he could sense the storm brewing. "They're going to try to tear me down," he said flatly, already bracing for the inevitable. "Exactly," Dana shot back, her voice crackling with certainty. "They've already started leaking garbage to the press, old photos of you at parties, rumors about your love life. They're building a narrative to paint you as some reckless celebrity who thinks the rules don't apply to him." Marcus's jaw tightened, a familiar fury simmering beneath his skin. "Of course they are," he muttered bitterly. "But we've got the truth on our side," Dana pressed on, her confidence unshakable. "That footage doesn't lie. And we've dug up Ricard's multiple complaints against Walsh for racial profiling and excessive force. The department buried every single one. They can't dodge this." He turned from the window, leaning against the wall as the weight of her words settled over him. "So what's the move?" he asked, resigned but curious. "We go public," Dana said without missing a beat. "We hold a press conference. You tell your story. Your way. We don't let them spin this into their version of events." Marcus hesitated, the thought of facing more cameras, more prying eyes, twisting his gut. He'd spent years dodging the spotlight when it came to his personal life, perfecting the art of staying silent. But silence had never saved anyone like him, not really. The world was watching now, and he couldn't deny the power in taking control. "All right," he said softly, the decision settling into place. "Let's do it." 2 days later, Marcus stood behind a podium in a cramped conference room, the air thick with anticipation and the staccato flash of cameras. Reporters jostled for position, their notebooks poised like weapons, while activists and curious onlookers filled the edges of the space, their murmurs a low, electric hum. Dana stood at his side, flipping through her notes with a practiced calm. But Marcus didn't need a script. He'd spent sleepless nights replaying every detail: punch, the fall, the shamoodle. It was etched into his bones. Now, all he had to do was let it out. He gripped the podium's edges, his knuckles whitening as he cleared his throat. The room hushed, every eye trained on him, waiting. "I never wanted to be here," he began, his voice steady despite the wild thudding of his heart. "I never asked to stand in front of all of you like this. All I wanted was a homey, a place where I could just be Marcus, not Marcus Reed the actor. Not a headline, not a symbol, just me. But that's not what I got." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, feeling the room shift beneath their gravity. "On October 12th, I was attacked by Officer Peter Walsh right outside my own front door. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't care about the truth. He saw my skin and decided I didn't belong, decided I was a threat before I even opened my mouth." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Marcus pressed on, his voice gaining strength, fueled by a fire he hadn't known he possessed. "This isn't some one-off mistake. What happened to me happens every day to black men and women all over this country. The only difference is someone caught mine on camera. But what about all the times there's no video? What about the voices that get silenced, the stories that never make it this far?" He scanned the sea of faces, seeing anger, empathy, and curiosity staring back at him. This isn't just about one cop with a temper. It's about a system that props him up, that sweeps complaints under the rug, that turns a blind eye when power gets twisted into violence. Dana gave him a subtle nod, her lips pressed into a tight line, but her eyes gleamed with quiet pride. Marcus drew a breath, steadying himself. "I've spent my whole career under a microscope," he continued, "and I know what it's like to be judged for how I look, what people assume about me. But this is bigger. This is about every person who's been told they don't belong, who's been treated like a criminal in their own neighborhood, their own skin." A hand shot up from the crowd, a reporter, eager and impatient. Marcus pointed to her, bracing himself. "Mr. Reed," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. "What do you say to people who claim Officer Walsh made an honest mistake, that he was just doing his job?" Marcus felt a surge of something hot and fierce rise in his chest, But he kept his tone even, his words deliberate. I say an honest mistake doesn't leave you bleeding on your own doorstep. I say doing your job doesn't mean swinging first and asking questions later. If that's what they call justice, then we've got a hell of a lot more work to do. The room erupted into a flurry of noise, cameras clicking, voices overlapping, but Marcus stood tall. The lesson sinking deeper into his core: power unchecked breeds ruin, and justice, however hard-won, is the only shield against it. The courtroom buzzed with restless anticipation as every soul within its walls rose to their feet, only to settle back into the worn wooden benches as the judge claimed her seat. Behind the towering bench, her presence commanded silence, a stillness that seemed to ripple through the air like a heavy fog. The jury had deliberated, their decision now a tangible thing, locked within the folded paper clutched by the foreman. The judge's voice cut through the tension, steady and deliberate, carrying an authority that felt almost sacred in its gravity. She asked for the verdict, and all eyes turned to the woman tasked with delivering it, a middle-aged figure whose sharp gaze had lingered on Marcus throughout the trial, studying him with a quiet intensity that suggested she saw far more than just the surface of his story. She rose slowly, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she gripped the paper, nodding to the judge with a solemnity that seemed to anchor the room. "We have, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the weight it carried. Marcus sat frozen, his chest tight, his breath caught somewhere deep within him as though his lungs had forgotten how to expand. Every muscle in his body coiled, bracing for the words that would either lift him or crush him entirely. The foreman handed the paper to the judge, who accepted it with a measured grace, her fingers unfolding it with a slowness that felt deliberate, almost theatrical. She read silently at first, her eyes tracing the lines of ink that held Marcus's fate, her expression unreadable. Then she lifted her gaze to the room, her voice rising once more, clear and resolute. "In the matter of Reed versus Walsh, we find the defendant, Peter Walsh, guilty of excessive force, misconduct, and racial discrimination." The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the courtroom. A collective exhale swept through the onlookers, some in relief, others in disbelief. Marcus felt his chest cave inward, as though the breath he'd been holding since that fateful night had finally escaped, leaving him hollow yet strangely alive. Beside him, Dana's hand found his arm, her fingers pressing gently into his skin. Her face broke into a small, triumphant smile, a flicker of light in the storm of emotions swirling around them. They had won, but for Marcus, the victory felt incomplete, a fragile thing dangling just out of reach, overshadowed by the scars that still ached beneath his skin. Across the room, Walsh's lawyer leapt to his feet, his voice already slicing through the air with promises of an appeal, his hands gesturing with the frantic energy of a man grasping at straws. Marcus barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on Peter Walsh, the man who had once loomed so large in his nightmares. Now, Walsh seemed diminished, shrunken in his chair, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared down at the scuffed floor. The verdict had stripped him bare, peeling away the armor of authority he'd once worn so arrogantly. There were no handcuffs, no immediate march to a just the raw, public declaration of his guilt, a spotlight searing through the shadows he'd hidden in for so long. For now, that was enough. It had to be. The lesson here was stark. Power, when wielded without restraint, carried consequences that could unravel even the mightiest. Outside, the world waited, as Marcus and Dana stepped toward the courthouse steps. The murmur of the gathered crowd swelled into a roar of applause, cheers, chants that rolled over them like a tide. Justice for Marcus, Black Lives Matter. The words crashed together, filling the air with a raw, electric energy that seemed to pulse through the sea of faces below. Signs bobbed above the throng, bold letters proclaiming truths too long ignored, while banners fluttered in the breeze like flags of a hard-won battle. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of support that lifted Marcus even as it threatened to drown him. He paused at the top of the steps, his breath catching as he took it all in. Somewhere off to the side stood Greg, his friend and steadfast ally, his face alight with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, as though he'd carried this burden alongside Marcus every step of the way. Marcus's gaze drifted further, searching until it landed on his mother. She stood apart from the chaos, a quiet figure wrapped in a coat too thin for the crisp air, her soft smile radiating a pride that needed no words. She hadn't set foot in the courtroom too many memories of pain lingered there, but she'd been his rock, waiting each night with a warm meal and a listening ear, her presence a balm to his frayed nerves. Dana nudged him gently, her voice a whisper against the clamor. "This is your moment, Marcus." He drew a deep breath, the cool air sharp in his lungs, and stepped forward. Reporters surged closer, microphones thrust toward him like eager hands, cameras zooming in to capture every flicker of emotion on his face. But Marcus wasn't thinking of them. His mind drifted to the people who'd stood by him: Dana, Greg, his mother, and to the countless others whose stories had never made the headlines, whose voices had been silenced by the same system that had nearly broken him. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every bruise, every moment of doubt. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he began, the words raw and unpolished. "I didn't ask for any of this. But what happened to me wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that lets people like Peter Walsh abuse their power and walk away unscathed." Time and time again, the crowd murmured, a swell of agreement tinged with anger and fragile hope. "I'm grateful for today's verdict," he went on, "but this isn't the end. It's just one step. This fight isn't over, not for me, and not for the people who face this every day. The ones who don't have cameras or crowds to back them up. We can't stop here. We won't." The applause that followed was a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the earth beneath his feet, but Marcus barely registered it. This wasn't a victory speech, it was a vow, a line drawn in the sand. He had crossed into a new reality, one where retreat was no longer an option. As he stepped back, a reporter's voice pierced the din. "What do you hope happens next, Marcus?" He turned, the weight of the moment still pressing down on him, though it no longer felt like a burden he couldn't bear. "I hope this case proves something," he said, his voice firm. "That it's not about fame or money or who you know. Racism, brutality, injustice they touch all of us, whether we see it or not. And we can't keep pretending they don't." The crowd surged forward as he descended the steps, hands reaching out to clasp his, voices calling his name. Amid the chaos, a flicker of something unexpected stirred in his chest up. The world hadn't shifted overnight. Walsh would likely appeal, and the roots of the system they'd challenged ran deep, tangled in decades of neglect. But for the first time, Marcus felt the reins of his story in his own hands. His pain had become his strength, a force he could wield, and there was no turning back. Months later, Marcus sat on the porch of his modest home, the very spot where it had all begun. The neighborhood hummed with a quiet stillness, not the tense hush that had once hung over it, but a peace that felt earned. The media storm had faded, the protests had scattered, yet the conversation lingered, a thread woven into the fabric of his life. He hadn't let it die. True to his word, Marcus had spoken at rallies, sat for interviews, used every ounce of his platform to amplify the voiceless. He was no longer just an actor playing a part, was an advocate, a warrior, a beacon for those who'd been cast aside. His phone buzzed, a message from Greg lighting up the screen. "You're on the front page again. People are listening." A faint smile tugged at his lips as he set the phone aside. He'd come to this place seeking solitude, a refuge from the spotlight. Instead, he'd found purpose, a calling that stretched far beyond himself, into a future he couldn't yet see but was determined to shape. The lesson of justice, he realized, wasn't just in the verdict, it was in the fight. The refusal to let power go unchecked, and the courage to demand a world that answered to its people. This was only the beginning.